Freedom Flotilla has poured almost 65,000 Cuban refugees ashore in Florida. But there still are thousands left in Cuba who want to leave, and the Castro government is doing all it can to encourage them. Charles Gomez reports from Mariel Bay, Cuba.
Despite President Carter's order that boat captains leave Mariel Bay without refugees, government officials here continue to bring thousands of Cubans by bus to the harbor. Today's group of refugees include not only the young men that have made up a large part of those arriving in the United States, but women with young children, as well as the elderly. They are anxious to leave, but obviously still have thoughts of those they must leave behind. Despite recent mishaps at sea, the boats continue to be jammed over capacity on a sea lift that the United States government seems unable to deter. Cuban officials deny that they are fining boat captains who wish to leave without Cubans. The process for those who wish to leave once they get to the harbor is simple. The walk from bus to boat is brief. Fidel Castro has made it clear through the official government newspaper Grama that boats will continue to leave Mariel Bay filled with refugees, and that Cuba's approval of a U.S.-sponsored air and sea lift is contingent on the discussion of other issues, notably the economic blockade, alleged CIA surveillance flights over the country, and the continued American naval presence in Guantanamo. Charles Gomez, CBS News, Havana.
The Times of London suggests that this country suffers, quote, some kind of inner failure that is both more difficult to identify and more difficult to cure than aberration of policy, unquote. Item, American Lawyer magazine notes that although 13 New Yorkers were murdered last New Year's Day, no one has yet been tried for those crimes. Item, in Los Angeles, where more than 1,000 persons have been murdered this year, city officials are holding a crime prevention meeting tomorrow. And in Dade County, Florida, which has recorded more than 560 homicides in 1980, violence is being answered with violence. From Miami, Steve Croft reports.
The scene has become commonplace. Code 31, another sheet-draped body bound for the county morgue. The murder rate has shot up 70%. The head of Miami's Police Benevolent Association has warned that the criminal justice system can no longer protect the public and urged people to arm themselves. This holiday season in Miami, people have been giving guns to the ones they love. Year-round sales are up nearly 40%, 700 handguns registered in one day. Some South Floridians are calling home Dodge City. It is a response to what authorities call an unprecedented epidemic of violence. Lawyers, doctors, judges, and housewives like Claudia McAvoy are taking weapons courses.
I would not be in that house alone without a gun.
Have things gotten that bad down here?
Since the May riots, they appear to.
But the racial tension that exploded in Liberty City and claimed 18 lives is only part of the problem. There is a drug war raging in the streets over billions of dollars in cocaine. Police say 1 in 3 killings is drug-related, that as many as 100 paid assassins may be plying their trade here. Finally, there are the new residents, 100,000 of them. Cuban boat people mostly with no jobs and no English. Nearly 300 have been arrested on felony charges, and their presence here has strained Miami to the breaking point.
The human machine is set on edge. People are under a great deal of stress. And in this stressful state, under trivial provocation, we get intense and even explosive outbursts of violence.
There have been murders over minor traffic accidents in parking places, a fatal shootout over a lawnmower.
Some of these homicides are absolutely ridiculous. You know, they're taking a human life over absolutely nothing.
There have been drug killings on dirt roads and multiple murders in wealthy neighborhoods.
The police are going to stop giving out tickets on 79th Street Causeway, and they're going to patrol these streets day in and day out, and I will see to it.
But the police have their own problems. They're short-handed, and there is no place to put the criminals they do arrest. The jails are overflowing. Citizens have begun taking matters into their own hands.
More than 30 suspected criminals have been gunned down by private citizens this year. Homeowners, merchants trying to protect their lives and property. In fact, civilians are killing as many suspected criminals as the police are.
And if you hesitate because you have compassion, you are the person who's going to die. And the reason you're going to die is because that moment of hesitation is going to be the last moment that you're going to spend.
A number of emergency measures have been enacted to protect the public. The beaches and parks are closing early. Miami Beach has enacted a controversial stop and frisk ordinance, and the governor is sending 100 state troopers to free the police of routine traffic chores. But it's not likely to ease the fear in a city where one bank is now enticing new customers with a mace-like spray repellent for personal protection, and where statistics show your chances of being murdered are now greater than your chances of dying in a traffic accident. Steve Croft, CBS News, Miami.
It became commonplace in South Florida. Shots are fired, people are killed, and much of the time the victims or the killers, or both, are people who came over from Cuba in the boat lift of 1980. Last night, it happened in Miami Beach. 2 men, 120, 144, cut down in a hail of gunfire. The 2 were so-called Freedom Flotilla refugees. The gunman got away. And as Bernard Goldberg reports, last night's killings are only a ripple in a wave of violence that rolls far beyond Florida.
They were not just the tired, the poor, and the hungry. They were also Fidel Castro's murderers, robbers, and rapists. Most of the 125,148 were decent people who came to start new lives. Some, perhaps 25,000, came to resume their old ones.
They don't think anything of committing a crime or killing you or anything. They seem life is very cheap.
They are also the worst type of animals in our society.
It'd be like if an invading army was dropped in here to rape, pillage, and burn in our town. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Little Havana, a well-established Cuban community in Miami, knows what other places are just finding out. Right before the boat lift refugee sailed from Mariel, Cuba, major crime in Little Havana had gone up just 3% over the previous year. After they settled in, major crime went up 89%. And police say Los Bandidos, the bandits as they are called, were responsible for at least 1 out of every 3 of Miami's 226 murders last year. And they've charged this man with 2 of them, Mario Lara, 28. Police say he raped one woman, killed her sister to make sure she didn't testify against him, then tied up his own girlfriend and stabbed her to death with a butcher knife. He's awaiting trial.
To me, the Mariel criminal is a totally amoral person. These people, these criminals, they're killing for, it would appear, just the ruthlessness of it or the joy of it.
Here in Miami, they've been living with the crime, the violence that washed ashore in the wake of the Freedom Flotilla. But many of Fidel Castro's criminal brigade have left South Florida, and now a frightening pattern is developing. Wherever they go, they take their special brand of viciousness with them. The Bronx, New York. 3,000 from the Freedom Flotilla settled here. This woman alone, a welfare recipient known as La Madrina, the godmother, sponsored 82 refugees. Even she admits some of them are criminals. And police say it's Castro's outcasts who are turning things from bad to worse. They commit about 100 serious crimes a month here, according to officials, who say letting them into the Bronx was like General Custer asking Sitting Bull to send in more Indians. 20-year-old Felipe Rodriguez, one of the boat lift bandidos. He has just been convicted in a brutal murder, luring another Cuban into a car, shooting him 6 times at point-blank range, stealing $400 from the dead man, then dumping his body on a sidewalk.
They're against the community. They're against all of us. You would think they were foreign invaders, aliens, the way they operate.
Union City, New Jersey, a Cuban enclave since Castro's first exile settled here 20 years ago. 8,000 new refugees arrived in this latest exodus, more than any place outside of South Florida. And the police chief says the criminals among them have committed more than 500 crimes since they got to Union City. And he says he's had it.
I'd like to get them all out of Union City and send them back to Miami and then back over to Fidel Castro. I'd like to put them right on a big boat and send them right back, because I think he put something over on us.
And even here, in the Cuban neighborhoods of South Florida, many would agree, saying the criminals are driving a wedge between Cubans and non-Cubans. Listen to Raul Martinez, the first Cuban-born mayor of Hialeah.
They're committing the crimes. Many of them are getting away with committing the crimes, and they're giving everybody else a very bad name in the Cuban community.
For nearly 2 years, it was viewed as Miami's problem alone. Not anymore. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Miami.
100,000 Cubans who arrived in the United States in the Mariel Boatlift of 1980 were just looking for a better life. But as was the case with many other waves of new immigrants, some of them were looking for a place to continue a life of crime. While the fight over whether to send at least some of these undesirable immigrants back to Cuba is being played out in the courts, some of their violent crimes are being played out on the nation's streets. Rita Braver reports.
This is a dark-skinned Hispanic male, heavy build, about 6 foot tall, mustache.
In Union City, New Jersey, a vicious attack. The victim is a Mariel refugee, twice arrested for drug dealing, and police suspect this fight too may have been over drugs. But no one is talking.
Don't move, please. Try not to move.
Man, they would beat him on his chest with a bat. Local law enforcement officials here and all over the country, from New York to Wisconsin to California, say that 4 years after the Cuban boat lift, they're still trying to cope with a huge crime problem, one that will not be solved by the new agreement to send 2,700 undesirables back to Cuba.
As far as I'm concerned, it's simply tokenism.
Harrisburg police detective Richard Alvarez, himself of Cuban descent, was alarmed by the statistics in his city, where only 500 Mariels live.
125 Mariel Cubans have been arrested for all varieties of crime. Of those 125, they've committed 481 crimes.
But the federal government has no real tracking system for Mariel crime, so Alvarez set up his own, collecting information and sharing it with other police departments.
I had Garden City, Kansas call me. Who ever heard of Garden City, Kansas? They've got problems. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Tucson, El Paso, Las Vegas.
You're innocent. We don't even do nothing.
In Las Vegas, for example, police say Mariels now control a third of the street cocaine traffic and commit a quarter of the murders. Police say the special Mariel tattoos seem to be worn as emblems of a violent lifestyle.
Big tattoo of Madonna.
And in Miami, hardest hit of all, there is trouble in the streets and in the courtrooms.
Our courts are clogged because Castro's criminals have been here since 1980 and are now repeating criminal acts. I think that the federal government owes it to the people again, throughout the country, not only here in South Florida, to track and follow these criminals.
There has long been disagreement over the extent of Mariel crime. The federal government estimates only a few of the 125,000 aliens are hardened criminals, but some state estimates put the number from 25,000 to 40,000. And now police around the country are seeing the emergence of Cuban crime networks.
They're highly organized now, and they deal in the crimes of murder, murder for hire, murder for contract, and export, importation of marijuana, cocaine, and other drugs.
Local officials want a stronger federal effort against Mariel crime, the way there is against other ethnic crime organizations. And they say they need more help in identifying repeat offenders.
Here's an example. The man I'm showing you here, he's presently awaiting sentencing for a shooting. This man's a Mariel. This man has 15 aliases. I still don't know today who this man really is. Pretty much the federal government said, okay, boys, here they are, now they're yours.
092204, Mommy.
And police say it will be their problem for a long time to come.
You copy that description, Sergeant?
That's affirmative. I got it. I'm going out now.
Rita Braver, CBS News, Union City, New Jersey.
Force Base runway in Georgia today, the first ever agreement reached between the Reagan administration and Castro's Cuba was implemented. The first of the Mariel Boatlift people kept in custody in the United States and deemed undesirable were deported. Peter Van Sant reports the end of appeals, but not debate.
They had left Cuba nearly 5 years ago, floating to freedom as part of the Mariel Boatlift. Today, 23 Cubans, having exhausted their legal appeals, were sent back to Cuba, marking the first significant immigration from the U.S. to Cuba since 1958.
They admitted to committing serious crimes in Cuba, have committed serious crimes in the United States, including murder, aggravated assault, and robbery by force.
Despite their criminal past, lawyers for the jailed Cubans fought to keep them stateside, saying a return to Cuba could mean death.
God knows what's going to happen to these fellows when they go back.
We believe they'll suffer various forms of persecution, possibly extremely severe.
The 23 Cubans sent back today are the first of more than 2,700 Cubans who may be returned over the next 2 years. More than 1,700 are being held at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. U.S. officials say that among the 120,000 Mariel refugees were hundreds of hardened criminals and mental patients, placed in the flotilla by Cuban government officials. Many went from boat to jail, having admitted to committing serious crimes in Cuba. Others were freed, only to be arrested for breaking U.S. law. The return to Cuba of more refugees may be delayed by further legal challenges. The Cuban government has agreed to accept about 100 Marielitos a month, while in return allowing up to 30,000 Cuban relatives to emigrate to the U.S. every year. Peter Van Sant, CBS News, Atlanta.
Okay, this is what we call the setup shot, and if you've done these interviews, you know that. And we're hoping, at this rate, we've got a couple of pieces of tape that we're waiting for around the country, but we're hoping that this piece will air sometime next week. And really, as I said, the basis of the piece is that we are hearing that that despite the fact that a lot of the worst cases will be returned to Cuba, law enforcement officials around the country, very serious problems. They say at least now you've got the federal prosecutors who are prosecuting as many of these cases as they can under as federal crimes. So I guess there has been some movement in kind of the federal effort. I guess the question is, who will go back to Cuba under the current agreement?
Well, the first people that will be returning under the current agreement are the 2,746 individuals that both countries have agreed upon with respect to identification. As we talked earlier, the agreement itself is a normalization of immigration proceedings between the two countries, and there are both benefits and obligations that both countries have to incur under that. The 2,746 individuals is by no way a finite number, just as individuals will be applying to come to the United States in the future through visas from Havana. There will be individuals who will be identified to the federal government and who may be arrested downstream, who would then be presented to the Cuban government as we present to any other government for removal under our immigration treaties.
So there is hope for the states then that that as they continue to identify Mariel refugees who are in fact criminals, that they won't be stuck with them in perpetuity.
Oh, absolutely not. There will people will be presented to the federal government. We will take those people into custody and will present them, as we do with any country, to the Cuban government for removal.
Why do we have some discrepancies in the numbers here with the state of Florida, for example, just to cite one, saying that they have 1,000 people that they have identified as Mariel refugees, and yet the government only saying, well, we only accept 200 of them as being Mariel refugees. What's the discrepancy here?
Well, I think two of the things you have to consider are, one, people do move in and out of federal and state penal systems. So you may have an individual who is in another state that has moved into Florida. You may have someone that was in federal custody that moved into state custody. In addition to this, most of the individuals we identify were identified as we said earlier, approximately in June. So you're always going to be catching up, if you will. But since the agreement does not restrict us in our movement of individuals who have committed serious crimes in the United States to Cuba, these individuals will be presented in due course and will be returned to Cuba.
What do you mean by serious crimes? How does the federal government define serious crimes?
Well, we have a concern both with the repeated offender, if you will, on misdemeanor types of crimes, as well as the individuals we have incarcerated right now in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary who have been convicted of murder, rape, kidnapping, assault, violence crimes that are very damaging, obviously, to our society, and these people are in our custody and will be removed.
Now, some people tell me that the federal government says, yeah, if we have a repeat offender, somebody who's done little small-time robberies, been involved in altercations in the neighborhood, that they'll serve a little bit of time and they'll come back out on the street, and the federal government doesn't really want to take those people into the system.
I don't think that's true. The federal government cannot take individuals until the state notifies us that they are in custody and they have either finished their term in state custody, or the state would, quote, commute their sentence, if you would, so we could take them into federal custody and remove them. Most of the people that we are notified of, we do place detainers on them, and once they are released from state custody, we will take control of them prior to removal, regardless of their nationality.
Mm-hmm. So you think that you have really rounded up all of the serious offenders who have been apprehended, sentenced, and served their time?
When we've been notified by the states of those, we have taken those into federal custody. There are a lot of people, obviously, that are in state custody now that have not completed their sentences. They have been identified to the federal authorities and continue to be identified on a daily basis. Detainers will be placed on those people, as we have in the state of Florida, for example, just recently. And when they are released from custody, we will make arrangements to return them to Cuba.
There was some screening done when these people first came over, and you did identify some people who were determined hardcore criminals. And yet, the states complained that the federal government did a really terrible job of tracking, of finding out who, in fact, was a serious criminal. What's the response to that?
Well, I think that the two things we have to be concerned about there are, one, we did have 125,000 people coming in without documentation, without coming to a normalized immigration checkpoint, if you will, from Cuba during the months of April to October in 1980. And also at that time we did not have any cooperation specifically from the government of Cuba with respect to identifying these people. So it was based on our best efforts, and I think they were good efforts, to identify people who had either committed crimes and served sentences in Cuba, or people who had committed crimes and not yet been sentenced in Cuba, to take into custody, and they were taken into custody, and a significant number of those people have remained there.
What about those who were let out?
Well, people that may have been let out, obviously a large number of those have been brought back into custody through parole revocation, if you will. But again, you know, you have a significant number of people coming in a very short amount of time, and you don't have any records from the other country with respect to even their identification. So you have to do the best that you can with the facilities and personnel that you have to identify people who have been in prison for crimes committed.
Of the 20,000 who you identified as having been in jail at one time or another, but you let most of those out anyway, has there been a tracking system to see where those people are now out in the States and what has become of them?
Well, most of the people obviously have migrated to areas of the country where there's a large Cuban community. We do have records on the people that came in that were processed, and we've used many of those records, and the background, if you will, convictions of people have accrued while they've been in the United States, in identifying the people that were on the original list to be returned to the Cuban government.
Why do you think then, if the federal effort you seem to think is pretty good on keeping the most dangerous Cubans off the streets, or most dangerous Mariel refugees off the streets, why do you think the states say that their problems are so high? Why do places like in Las Vegas, they say that 25% of their homicides are Mariel refugee related, 30% of their cocaine trafficking, they believe? How is it that that can be happening if in fact you are, through this system, getting the worst of the Cuban criminals?
Well, people do not have to have a criminal record to commit a crime. And while your initial screening may not catch everyone, you may release people who at a later date may decide that they are involved or want to be involved in criminal activities. Again, as we've mentioned earlier, we do have a very strong cooperative effort between both state and federal authorities now to control this crime situation, if you will, and to make sure that both federal and state authorities are geared up to meet the needs of the communities and taking care of that issue.
So you have a sense then that really that the crime wave that began when the Mariel refugees arrived in many places may in fact continue, and you'll just have to wait until people are convicted in order to make any attempt to remove them from the United States.
You have to have a legal basis to remove individuals. The Cuban Adjustment Act obviously is giving benefits of legal permanent residency and will become naturalized citizens for many of these individuals, but you cannot just remove a person, if you will, from the street or from the freedom to travel throughout the United States where they have not committed a crime that would give us a removable charge for immigration purposes.
Another complaint that we hear, and this isn't really your area, but we hear, hey, you know, there are task forces within the Justice Department. They look at organized crime among Colombians. They look at organized crime among La Cosa Nostra. They even look at Oriental organized crime. But nobody in the federal government is really paying any attention to the emergence of Cuban crime organizations based largely on those who came over in the Mariel Boatlift. Is this something that you think that the federal government should begin to address or can begin to address?
Oh, I think it's being addressed with respect to the different task forces we have now on organized crime as well as the drug trafficking. You will have individuals of all nationalities involved in this activity, and you clearly, because of the crimes that have been committed by some of the Cuban nationals we have in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, will be involving yourself with their operations as well.
Because the FBI, for example, says, no, we haven't targeted the Cuban crime organizations in any way. There's no special task force working on them. There's smaller ones maybe in some of the states, but not a real national effort toward helping to... Is it because it's just so diffuse there in so many places?
Well, I think it's a subject matter crime rather than the nationality, if you will, in this instance. You do have a lot of Cuban nationals in southern Florida, in New York and New Jersey, and as you know from your reporting, there are a lot of task forces operating in those areas based on specific types of crimes.
But the best news, you think, that comes out of this agreement is not just that 2,700 people are going to be returned, but that 2,700 people can be returned and that more people, as they are identified, can be returned as well?
It's very important to understand that this agreement normalizes immigration procedures between the two countries. This allows the United States, in essence, to have immigration activities with Cuba as we do with any country where we share immigration treaty, if you will, with that country. There are no restrictions or barriers on this, the immigration powers of the United States through this agreement. And there's nothing that's specialized, if you will, that would restrict any movement that we would have.
What about the petty crime, the domestic violence, that kind of neighborhood carousing that seems to have accompanied the movement of Mariel refugees into some of the neighborhoods? How can the federal government help the law enforcement agencies deal with these kinds of problems?
Well, on the individual crimes that people can be removed from the country from, they have to be a serious crime, as the Immigration Nationality Act requires. Domestic crimes, if you will, and lesser crimes, if you will, are something that the state and federal authorities have to work on with respect to solving that situation. But generally they would not reach the level of a excludable crime with respect to an individual case.
Is there any point that you wanted to make here that I didn't ask you about?
Well, I just think the most important thing to remember is that the agreement itself sets up normalized immigration procedures between the two countries. There are no restrictions on what the United States does. Individuals who are returned to Cuba will be returned in an orally and phased manner, and I think it's very important to understand that this agreement provides for future relations on immigration grounds between the U.S. and Cuba, so as people in the future apply for visas, for example, to come to the United States, people will be presented to the Cuban government for removal based on criminal infractions while they've been here.
Some people are saying that what this essentially does is only a few Cubans are really going to go back, and we're going to let people bring in their families, and that they tend to be the kinds of people who are rougher in the neighborhood, perhaps, who have a higher level of violence within the family than might be desirable on people who are immigrating into the country, and that really what the agreement does is legitimize a group of people who ought to be sent back in general, that we ought to really try to send back everyone who came in the Mariel Boatlift.
Well, I don't think that's correct with respect to the representation they've made. As you note, a very small percentage of the people that have come from the Mariel Boatlift have been involved in criminal activities. This agreement will afford us the opportunity to return those individuals to Cuba.
Okay, thank you. You just do it.